you, Shilpa. All right, so welcome everyone. My name is Lochamy. I serve as the chair of the English department at Hoover High School, and I'm proud to serve also on the board of Hoover-AHEAD, which, as Shilpa mentioned, is a nonprofit here in our community focused on promoting racial and ethnic equity and inclusion in our city. Let me begin by thanking everyone for taking time to be here today for this important discussion. As I'm sure you've noticed, we have all been engaged in and impacted by a dialogue in recent years about how we as a community and as a country should approach questions of diversity, equity, and inclusion. There are some who have suggested that efforts to address these questions at all are somehow divisive or problematic. Hoover-AHEAD feels, of course, though, that is not the case. We've invited three esteemed professionals with expertise in the area of DEI to join us today to share their perspectives about why diversity initiatives are not only not nefarious, but in fact vitally important if we hope to develop the citizenry and communities that we hope to see down the road, ones capable of accomplishing Hoover-AHEAD's vision, where in matters of DEI, everyone feels comfortable, safe, valued, seen, and understood. But whereas we recognize that not everyone in our community sees the issue the same way we do, our goal today is to foster a productive dialogue where everyone is welcome and encouraged to share their genuinely held questions and or concerns in a respectful manner. So I will introduce our three guests in just a moment, then we will hear brief presentations from each of them before opening the floor for a question and answer period. Okay, so without further ado, let me just read our brief bios and introductions. We'll bring our guests up one at a time. So our first guest is Dr. Terry Lamar, who is the Hoover City Schools Chief Administrator Office, previously the Director of Equity and Education Initiatives. He completed his undergraduate work at the University of Alabama and has experience as a physical education teacher, school counselor, assistant principal, and principal. He obtained a doctorate from Samford University. Dr. Lamar is passionate about working with at-risk students and providing guidance to their families. He strongly advocates empowering the youth with the personalized tools they need to make wise, lifelong decisions. Let's give a round of applause to Dr. Terry Lamar. All right, next up is Dr. Gregory Samuels, who was a high school social studies teacher for 12 years before becoming an associate professor of teacher education and chief diversity and inclusion officer at the University of Montevallo. He is also a co-principal investigator on the Year of Jefferson County grant, providing multiple services to students, teachers, and families of Jefferson County and Greater Birmingham City Schools. More than anything, he knows that his work in communities and higher education is only strengthened and further informed by interacting with social justice advocates in the community, educators, and organizations like those here today. So please welcome Dr. Gregory Samuels. And finally, it's a pleasure for me to introduce a friend and former colleague of mine. Ivory Sirmans is the Education Coordinator for Diversity Education in the Office of the Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at UAB. She began working at UAB in November of 2020. She earned a Bachelor of Science in Education with a concentration in secondary education, history, and geography. And prior to her time at UAB, she was a high school teacher at Hoover High School, among other places, for over 10 years, teaching all grade levels and subjects, including both U.S. and world history. So, Ivory Sirmans. All right, and so to start, I would like to turn the podium over to our guests, and we'll hear just a brief presentation from each of them, and then we will have a question and answer period. So please do be thinking about the questions that you have for our panelists at the conclusion of their presentations. Okay, we'll start with Dr. Terry Lamar.
I guess you're trying to say I'm much shorter.
No.
Well, thanks for having me. I was actually looking forward to this event. I think Miss Sharonita Reese was the first person that said, hey, would you be interested in coming to speak at an event here with Hoover-AHEAD? And I said, absolutely. And then the very next day, Mr. Lochamy came and said, hey, would you be willing to come and speak at an event at Hoover-AHEAD? And I said, absolutely. He said, are you sure? And I said, I am. And so that's why I'm here today. But what I want to talk about is some of the things that we have going on in Hoover. The first thing that we do, so all of our equity training that we do in Hoover is based off our student focus groups. So the initiatives that we've had in the past has been based on what the students have said we need to focus on. So it's not something that Terry Lamar comes up to the table, or a principal or a teacher, and says, here's what we need to focus on. It is 100% what the student says the PD should be in our district. And so what we have done is we required equity training for all Hoover City Schools employees each year. And that's been going on since 2019. And that information is on our district website, so you can look and see. If you just go to Hoover City Schools, Director of Equity and Education Initiative, you can find the actual sites. And actually, Dr. Samuels here from University of Montevallo, they've actually provided the very first training for our district. And it was on just multiple conversations, but it was still based on what the students said we needed. And so we spent a good amount of time with University of Montevallo looking through those students' focus groups results. And then I hate to call out both individuals on the panel here, and then Ms. Ivory Sirmans, who was in Hoover at the time, she and I personally sat down together and coded those focus groups results. And then we put that into PowerPoint presentations, and that's what we started in terms of with Hoover. I also want to talk about, we have some new initiatives going on with our alternative school as well. What we noticed is we started having an increase of students in our alternative program. And part of what I've done in the role that I'm in is to go out and talk directly to students. And so what does that look like? The students at the alternative school, I asked them, how can we make things better for you? And the number one thing they said, they want a better relationship with their school admins. And so now we set it up where any student that is assigned to the alternative school, the assigning admin will go over and build a relationship with that person based on the amount of time. Is the first time, is their second time? And we've noticed that has been helping a lot with that. And it cannot be conversations like, hey, why did you come here? And you know better. It is truly building a relationship with the individuals. Our discipline data, the way we've begun dissecting the discipline data, we're looking at students that are consistently coming back to the office. In the past, we just looked at pure numbers. That was not really showing us or teaching us anything. So at this point, it is all about how can we go and provide interventions and provide resources for students that are having to come back to the office or for disciplinary reasons over and over, if that makes sense. And we have a parent equity committee as well for our district. And on that parent equity committee, each person on that committee will represent some of our district. So for example, we're currently working on the district strategic plan. And what that means is we're setting the goals and the agenda for the next 5 years. There's a parent on that committee, our discipline code of conduct committees. There's a parent from the district equity committee that's on each one of the major committees that is part of Hoover City Schools, because we want the parents on that committee to be able to have influence and to be able to express concerns that they may have, and make sure when we look at that code of conduct and other pieces that they have a voice there as well. Black History Month. Every school in Hoover must, and they do, and it's not something we have to say, you better do this, but they actually enjoy that they have Black History Month, and that activities for every school, you would see them participating in Black History Month activities. One thing that came to my attention about 3 years ago is we did not have many HBCUs coming to Hoover. And so what we realized, there's a portal that you have to assign. And so we've gotten that information out to the HBCUs, and you see a huge influx now of HBCUs at Hoover High School, at Swain Park. And it was just really an admission counselor bringing it to my attention. And at that point, we corrected all of the necessary actions, and we are seeing a huge influx now of students getting that exposure to HBCUs. I mean, my son, who was at Spain Park, even mentioned, Dad, I want to look into Howard, because you're just beginning to have that access now that we didn't have previously. I would also say this as well, we have the most diversity in the central office and leadership positions at central office than we've ever had in Hoover history. We're about 44% of African Americans at the central office level. We are looking the same way with principals, with assistant principals. Our teachers, we're at the highest, but it's still one of those that is still needs a lot of work. And that's something that we plan to continue to work on as a district. And we're doing recruitment fairs, we're doing videos through the HR department, trying to find ways that we can recruit. Lastly, I will say is there was a national study coming out of Harvard and Stanford about Hoover City Schools, about them closing the achievement gap amongst Black, white, and students of color actually growing at a faster rate than anyone else in the state. And if you look at our report cards, Hoover, I think, is one of 5 or 6 districts in the state that actually every school received an A on a report card. So those are some of the initiatives. I don't realize how much time I would have to go through all of them, but I wanted to share with everyone here. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lamar. Okay, so next we will hear from Dr. Gregory Samuels from Montevallo.
First of all, I'm honored to serve on this panel, and even more honored to sit in front of you and engage and learn equally as much as hopefully I can give you all some information on my thoughts and feelings and what I do every day. So also, more than anything, I'd like to say that I'm always honored to hear stories. I was talking to Eddie a little bit earlier, and even others in this room who have done a lot of this work before I came along, to make things not necessarily comfortable, but also to lay out the battlefield and let us know what we need to do to make better citizens in our communities throughout our state, throughout the U.S. And this work is pretty controversial, so I really appreciate what some of you all have done before I came along. Once again, I'm Dr. Gregory Samuels. I'm an associate professor of secondary education in a teacher education program at the University of Montevallo. And I'm also chief diversity and inclusion officer. I also sit here today as a concerned citizen of local school districts, former high school educator of 15 years, used to be a high school social studies teacher, so I'm very fortunate to be able to know what it's like in the classroom outside and engage with our teacher educators as we send them out to you all schools. And I'm also a person of color who commonly advocates for voicing and at times amplifying America's history. I know we all have our own demographic, our own positionalities, our own experiences, and we all sort of fight this thing from our individual spaces. So I don't want to take that from anyone, but we all have our struggles every day, and so I definitely appreciate that and let you all know my positionality, where I come from, especially as I have some conversation with you all today. I used to be a high school social studies teacher before arriving at Montevallo, and I like to think that this is where I learned a level of creativity in teaching and learning. You see, some teachers simply give information to students in just a simple exchange, sort of a sit and get kind of way. I, on the other hand, would like to think that I engage on a deeper level of learning when I show students photographs from various eras of history, and I would ask them to tell me such things like, who is not pictured in this photograph that you're looking at in a social studies classroom? Who do you not see mentioned in these eras of history? I would ask them to tell me things such as, why is it important to consider the stories that are voiced as well as those that are silenced? In another lesson, I would ask students to not simply recite the accomplishments of Thomas Jefferson, but ask them to explore the stories of Sally Hemings and discuss how her story relates to that of Thomas Jefferson. In addition, I would ask students to explain the Willie Lynch letter and why green books were necessary for Black Americans and families traveling throughout the U.S. in the early to mid-1900s, people like my grandfather. You see, when you find a way to make people discover what's not said out loud or what is not readily seen, it has a way of deafening them upon arrival. It shocks their soul, but in a healthy way. Why are DEI efforts important? somebody say nefarious. It's to allow our educators and families to explore the school curriculum and local stories in a way that provides a more engaging experience. That is why it's important to put forth DEI efforts and initiatives in our communities and schools. In Montevallo, just before the pandemic, a few members of the Montevallo community worked with the EJ Act, or the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, to establish a memorial on our own Main Street. Some of you all may have seen that as you go downtown Montevallo. They established this memorial in order to provide a historic marker that denotes 2 black citizens who tried to live peacefully in the 1880s in Shelby County. Visiting this marker in Montevallo is what we all like to call doing the work. We all have to do the work on some level. It doesn't have to be going out in the streets and protesting. It doesn't have to be engaging in a conversation with someone. It could just be simply tweeting, or going downtown Montevallo and seeing this marker, or coming to engagements like this and just having conversation. And sometimes it's just listening. Listening is very important when we think about allyship. When I ask someone, have you been to the EJI in Montgomery? And they reply, oh no, I've been meaning to go, but I haven't had the chance. It bothers me. It lets me know and reveals how they feel or don't feel about lynching and racial terrorism without saying it out loud. How they feel about discrimination without saying it out loud. How they feel about oppression without saying it out loud. It lets me know. It should let all of us know how people feel when they avoid these situations. When people walk on the other side of the street opposite this marker in downtown Montevallo, or they roll up their window when they pass it and avoid conversation with their children, their cousins, their family members, it lets me know how they feel about DEI efforts and social justice advocacy that we all believe in here in this room. You see, they're telling us how they feel about things silently and out loud when they do things like not going to the EJI or coming to discussions like this. For those who don't want this contextual information in our educational curriculum or discussed anywhere in our schools, they're telling us about how they feel about lynching, racial terrorism, oppression, discrimination. They're telling us how they feel about hearing marginalized stories or not hearing marginalized stories. And I say we must actively resist this silence and attempts to silence the truth. So as Brian Stevenson says, we must be honest about the truth before we can reconcile the harsh realities of our country's past and, I argue, present. I speak from my heart when I say to each and every educator in this room, student of history, advocate of social justice, even our award winners, our babies. By you being here today, you're doing a good work. And as late Congressman John Lewis said, let's get in good trouble. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Samuels. Okay, and last but certainly not least, let's hear from Ivory Sirmans.
Thank you. My Lord, this is a little bit more. Again, hello to everyone, and thank you for allowing me to be here to share my perspective today with these amazing panelists as well. I was a secondary classroom teacher for over 11 years. I'm new to the DEI world in a way. I've only in the past few years began intentionally studying and gaining knowledge about what we call diversity, equity, and inclusion. When I began my career in Hoover, at Hoover High School, 2 weeks before school started in 2009, I was young, terrified. I was fresh out of college. I had no idea what I was doing. And the main question I had was, am I going to be able to teach this content? Like, how am I going to be able to do this? Not only, I was only like 6 years older than my students, so there's that. But I quickly realized upon starting in the classroom that there was another question that I was going to have to answer. I started to realize that my students needed something else And I wasn't really quite sure what they needed, and I wasn't really quite sure how I was gonna answer that question. What I did know is that myself as a Black woman entering into new suburban culture for myself, I'm from little old Florence, Alabama, and also not being really familiar with kind of wealth culture from a very low middle class family, that when I showed up to my classroom, the way I showed up, the way I existed as a Black woman was not what my students expected, and that was gonna be a hurdle. I had to figure out how I was gonna teach students that really didn't expect to see me as their teacher. In my time and being an educator, I was the only Black woman history teacher ever in my department, which spoke to me that I would probably be the only Black teacher that a lot of my students would ever have in their entire educational experience, K through 12. Myself, I have been in spaces where Black people were not the majority, or, it was not, a Black space. I had been in those spaces. What I had never been in was in a space where a Black person was the authority in the room. And that was me at 23. So I had some figuring out to do. And so what I began to do is I began to ask questions. I began to learn about the new space that I was in. I began to be vulnerable and show and express myself to my students, knowing that what I was showing them, what I was expressing to them, was very different from what they knew, what they had experienced, and what they had known. And what I realized is that by opening up myself, showing up fully and being present exactly how I was, not only allowed my students to learn the historical content that I was legally obligated to teach them, but it also gave them an opportunity to learn about me and learn about the cultures and the identities that I held. And so when we get to the point where we talk about DEI and its importance in schools, this is the goal. The goal is that our schools will be places and institutions where any student can show up exactly who they are, how they are, and be able to get a full-fledged education. That's the goal of DEI work in our schools. It can be categorized as other things and other points, but really as teachers, what we want to know is that when any type of student walks in our classroom, however they exist, in whatever way that they exist, even if they don't exist yet, that we will be prepared to teach them because that's what they deserve. I often am uneasy in having conversations like this about the importance of DEI work in our institutions, because the idea of explaining that DEI work in schools being important and not indoctrination feels painfully obvious. Some reasons for that is that being an educator for as long as I was, the idea of indoctrinating students in the classrooms is comical. It just doesn't really work that way. It doesn't happen in that way. Also, as a Black woman and someone that has almost never heard or seen people like myself in my educational experience from kindergarten through college, the idea that now that these views and these voices are starting to be heard and be seen is now considered indoctrination, it just doesn't feel good. The theme also of politics in this conversation cannot be erased or ignored in this conversation. Because of the political nature of some of these topics, it often means that individuals and groups spend a significant amount of time disproving something that has never happened or never argued. This means that the true conversation that has nuance, discomfort, and possibly no clear direction on a solution never actually happens, because the conversation is just an argument of what is and is not happening. With that being said, I hope to lead by example by staying present in my discomfort in the conversation, and also to lean into the feelings of discomfort. This work is difficult, and it does not always have a clear path for success or conclusion, but it is worth it. It is worth it because people have always been diverse and deserve equity and inclusion. And that should produce a society that creates feelings of belonging. DEI work is not important because of something we now recognize or something we now know. It is important because our differences have always been here. And everyone deserves to show up and be seen in their full humanity. This is the goal and should have always been the goal for our institutions and our society. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivory. Okay, so as is always the case in my classroom, after students get finished making presentations, I have a long list of questions I have, but I prefer not to use my questions. I want to pitch it to the room first and see what kinds of questions we have that can be directed either to one of our panelists in particular or to the panel on the whole. So at this time, and we have, about 25 minutes to chat through a few questions here and there. Would anyone like to get us started with a question that we have at this point? Oh, okay, yeah, we'll go to Eddie first.
Especially to Ivory. Ivory, I heard you say something that I hear a lot of people say. Of course, I think most of y'all know this is why I'm here for the last 35 years. This is what I do. Okay. The one thing that I want to say though, this is an uncomfortable subject. I created an 18 program to have intervention with mayors of cities, CEOs of corporations. And every time I get them in the room, it is very uncomfortable. But it's an uncomfortable that is good because until we actually have this conversation, we're not going to get to I always tell people DEI, actually diversity, equity, and inclusion. Diversity gets you the invitation to the party. Equity gets you into the room where the party's going. Inclusion gets you on the dance floor that you can dance. All right. The other thing I tell people is that diversity itself or discrimination, let's say, and I always use this as an example when I talk to a crowd, especially business people. Discrimination, I don't like ice cream with nuts in it. Okay? I detest it. I don't like it. But where it becomes racism is when I hate people who don't like ice cream with nuts in it. Okay? And so, as I said before, these conversations are uncomfortable. I have had people as a business person, and the only reason I'm directing it to you, I'm sure everybody out there know what I'm talking about if you're playing with diversity right now. I walked into a room with a group of businessmen, which was all executives from the company, all white. And I knew I had to diffuse it because I'm coming in as a business person. The first thing I asked them was the simple question. When I walked through the door with a briefcase, did you see a black man carrying a briefcase who happened to be a businessman? Or did you see a businessman who just happened to be black with a briefcase in his hand? And of course, it diffused everything. Of course, I knew what the answer was going to be. No, I saw a businessman who came through who just happened to be black. But what it is, the meeting went very smooth after that particular thing. So anyway, I thought I'd kick that off so maybe some more questions would come in.
Great, thank you, Eddie. So did you want Ivory to respond to that, or just to talk about?
If she would, because she said that she was in confidence.
So like how to broach these topics and to sort of break the ice and start difficult discussions. Ivory, what do you want to say about that?
Yes, I would say it really depends on how you're having the conversation, because if you're having it with individuals that are, peers, meaning your age, other adults, really understanding the culture that you're stepping into is essential. If you're coming in more of an academic culture, you can really maybe lean in some of that discomfort. If you're going into sometimes more in a business space, they may not be used to having some of those difficult conversations. So really having lots of tools in the toolbox is what I would suggest in that, and really being honest about the discomfort that could possibly happen in those moments. And really to make the comment about, what you said to the businessman, did you see me as a black man or I happen to be black? Really, I would say a goal would be you could see me as a black teacher coming into this classroom, but does that alter your expectation of what you're going to gain from me after you hear me speaking or as I'm conducting business with you? That to me would really lead into where we are and maybe the biases that we're holding and some of the stereotypes that maybe we're wrestling with.
Because I think it's definitely true, and certainly so in this particular political climate, that there is some discomfort around these sorts of topics. People do feel, worried about if they're going to misspeak or something they say will be misconstrued. And I know, Dr. Lamar, you and I talked recently about that this is something that we recognize on our campuses, that sometimes our students recognize that teachers may have levels of discomfort talking about these things. But as Eddie says, if we don't talk about these things, then we can't make progress on these questions. Speaking of questions, other questions we have for the panelists. Okay, hold tight 1 second.
Dr. Lamar, you talked about the fact that the Hoover schools focused a lot on Black history during the month of February, I can imagine. And that's good. But I'm curious to know from Ivory and from Dr. Samuels, how the colleges are preparing teachers to go out and teach Black history at times other than the month of February. It's out. I know one time we only had a week. We started with a week. Now we've been on a month for a long time. I'm ready for the month to expand, and I'm wondering if there's any focus from the colleges in preparing teachers. And I know that politically it'll be a problem because it depends on where they go with the school system and how that school system reacts with whatever they bring in. Is there any
Thank you for the question. It's a good question. So one thing that I hear in what you're asking, which I love, is inclusiveness in education, things coming full circle, and then pushing things beyond just mentioning, like History Month.
Yeah.
By the way, the shortest month. So at the University of Montevallo, what we try to do in other universities, in our curriculum, we have embedded special education, inclusive learners, inclusive practices course. And almost every teacher education program is like this. And some non-teacher education programs are like this. So when we have a diversity course, we try to communicate with our teachers in a way to say that diversity is important, or DEI is important, period. And we embed that in our curriculum. And then if they're teacher educators, we tell them how they can embed that in their own curriculum: math, science, English, business, FCS, et cetera, et cetera. And I personally try to push extra and say, don't just do this one time. As an early educator, as Ivory was saying, sometimes it's hard. You're just thinking about your content, you're thinking about classroom management, you want to do things right. So all these extras can be a challenge, especially when it comes to DEI, and including a lot of other people that aren't necessarily in the dominant narrative in our history books. That can be a challenge for a new educator. And so what I try to do, and other quality educators try to say, these are how you can sort of form post holes in your education. So whenever you get to this era in history, or this part of American government, or this part of science, you can drop in these lesson plans, or these people, or these activities. You can bring in speakers for these topics that come up. So we try little by little to say, embed it in your curriculum, and not necessarily even just in the diversity, equity, and inclusion courses that most colleges have in their teacher education programs, but even in science courses. So we try to do things like that. Or literacy, or reading, things like that. So reading different books, as our young award winners have shared with us today. So things like that help a lot.
Ivory, did you have something you want to add to that?
Yes, I'll quickly add. One thing that I've had the opportunity to do in being in UAB is to go back to school, and a part of some of the things that I've been asking and considering is the preparedness of pre-service teachers with their own ability to assess their own personal biases and also their own levels of cultural humility and intelligence. Because if I am aware of my identity and how I show up in the room, and if that identity is in the center or in the margins, doing or adding in things with, Black Americans or Indigenous Americans won't be extra. It'll just be how it is because I'm now aware how I exist and how I move through the world. And so some of this can be done really in all professions in the aspect of, instead of treating some of this as morality, really thinking about it as a skill set. Do people possess the skill of being able to self-interrogate the ideas and the thoughts and the beliefs that they have when they are pushed against someone else that shows up a bit differently from themselves?
And Dr. Lamar, I wonder as a quick follow-up, if you might be able to speak just a little bit, because you mentioned this a little bit in your presentation earlier. If the question is, what are we doing at the teacher education program level to prepare professionals? Of course, we have a lot of existing professionals in our system. If you could maybe speak just a little bit more to what Hoover City Schools has been doing in recent years to make sure that our existing teachers are better prepared to teach this material and have these discussions.
Absolutely. And one thing I would share also, I grew up in Mobile County school system, and a product of Pritchard, Alabama. I'm not sure if you all have heard of Pritchard, but K through 12 was spent with all Black students. And so my first year of, and I am going to answer your question. My first year of college was at Alabama State University, which you're looking at about 95, 96% African American as well. It wasn't until I went to the University of Alabama that I started having exposure to different backgrounds, different racial ethnicities, and so on. But in that time in Mobile County, K through 12, we didn't learn anything about Black history in an all-Black school, K through 12, in Mobile County, in Pritchard, and you can talk to anyone during that time frame. And so that's one of those pieces that I wanted to make sure, even in Hoover, that we bring to the table. And last thing I'll say about that before you answer the question, thankfully, many kids in that system that's in Pritchard, still today, you look at the education opportunity, the parents are putting out more so just get a high school diploma and you've made the ultimate achievement. And honestly, I wouldn't be sitting here today if it wasn't for a teacher who basically forced me to go to college 2 weeks before graduation. But what I learned in that process was there were about 10 students, and I hate to say this part, that said, now if Terry can go to college, then I know I'm going too. And so that was a lot of motivation. That was motivation for 10 additional individuals. But in Hoover, what we're trying to do is make sure that the curriculum, we're diversifying the curriculum. We're making sure that kids can see themselves when you walk inside the room. What do they see? We're trying to make sure that we highlight the leadership, because Black history is not something that should be taught. I agree with you 100% in Sirmans, where it should be part of what we do. It should be part of it should be embedded in everything that takes place in our school system. That's where we're going, where it is not 1 month. We're working with the Alum Leadership Institute. We're looking at some focus groups now. Mr. Lochamy is a part of that process as well. That we want to get some feedback from our students, and that's what we want to know. Are we doing enough from where we were in 2019 to 2023? And those are things that I want to make sure that we are addressing. But it is conversations that are being had at the district level, conversations that are being passed down to the principals, and the principals are passing that conversation down to the to the teachers.
Thank you. All right, other questions? I had one back here, and then we have a student question too. I'll get to you. Don't worry. Hold tight.
Dr. Lamar, I've probably like 3 questions, but at what age do those student groups start for the DEI groups, and how do parents become a part of that parent equity committee? And what is the, I have a student at Bluff Park Elementary who is Black, and a lot of the curriculum that came home was very, for Black History Month was amazing, but are all teachers in the elementary school on the same page for that? Is there something given for that? Or do they kind of Google something, pull it off, send it home kind of thing? Just looking forward to like what years to come, because the questions that we asked, there wasn't a lot of, with Moses, what did you learn? It was pretty basic, which was totally appropriate, but what kind of ideas are y'all pushing forward in elementary schools?
If you want more information about the Parent Equity Committee, if you will send me an email, or if you will give me a call, you just call 205-439-1000 and ask for me. And they'll probably send you to Jennifer Garza.
Okay.
And then just tell them we had this conversation. The second question,
When it came to materials that are
What-
teachers on
well,
the same page.
Yeah, and what age do
what age?
you guys?
So what we do
Yeah.
is, and this is not me trying to not answer your question.
No, you're fine.
What we do now in K through 5, we have whatever the course of study and the standards, we make sure we can teach through that. And I'll tell you, there's been legislation passed where you have to make sure you are teaching what's considered the age-appropriate lessons to students. And trying to define what is age-appropriate is very difficult. But it starts in kindergarten. We got teachers that are doing some really creative things, but it's not in the sense of what you would get in a middle school or a high school setting. So it's a little more subtle. For example, there's a book, I think it's called Crayons. And with that book, you're talking about being different. You're talking about colors. You're talking about all of these pieces and components. But it is not the style that's going to really hit. But in 4th grade, you start to see a bigger emphasis with Alabama history. So 4th grade would be it.
And was your question also about the focus groups of students?
Yeah, what age do you guys?
Participate in the
yeah,
focus
Or
groups.
what is appropriate and inappropriate?
So that's one that we've done. It is juniors and seniors.
Okay.
Is what we're focusing on. We
Okay.
tried. We made calls. I hate to keep calling you on this, but Ms. Sirmans and I, we remember the elementary kids. We had a lot of parents who said they do not want their kids participating in focus groups. Middle school parents said they did not want their kids participating in focus groups. And I had individuals calling parents and so on, and we realized even 9th grade parents said they did not want their kids participating in focus groups. So at that point, you're like, we need this information from someone. And so we decided to go with juniors and seniors. So answer your question.
Okay, I know we have a question from one of our students, so hold tight 1 second.
I just wanted to know, what is Hoover City Schools doing to, I guess, recruit more African American teachers?
That's a great question, and I can see why you want the essay. But what I will say is, we now have an HR plan that includes anyone that we hire, you have to interview African American candidates. Any panel must consist of an African American on that panel as well. And I think that's why we've seen that increase. I think now having and we also do recruitment fairs. So we're going out to Miles College, Alabama State, we're going to Georgia, to Morehouse and places like that now to recruit. But even in the recruiting efforts, what we've learned is visually, what do you see? And so now we have created videos and we've created pamphlets where you can absolutely see African Americans in leadership positions. Because if we just come to the schools and you sit at a table like this and you're thinking Hoover City Schools, do that speak to me? And we need to let them see we have it. Are we going to be ashamed of it? Absolutely not. And so the videos, we've gotten feedback and we've had applicants come in and say, this was very helpful because it showed that you all will at least value me. And the other side of that is, not only hire someone, but how do we retain them? Because when you look at when typically, I can't speak for every industry, but even talking with my wife here about this as well, you may hire an African American, but what are we doing to make sure that they remain and give them the tools and the resources that they need? Because hiring, you can go all day, but if you got to get rid of that person because you failed to provide the resources they need, then we have failed those teachers in general.
That's a great question there. Dr. Samuels and Ivory, I've got a quick question for you because I think it's something that has been a big part of the discussion in recent years. Some people will raise a concern that we should not talk about DEI or race and racism because it's going to make white students feel uncomfortable or guilty. And I wonder if you could just speak to that concern and why it is one that apparently you don't share. How do you view that question or concern when people say this is work we shouldn't be doing for that reason?
sometimes I think it's difficult coming from a place or an individual in America that has experienced the history that people of color have experienced. I try not to be biased about this, but I come from a perspective of social studies teachers. We know about Japanese internment camps, but if not, we know that Japanese internment camps occurred, and that is uncomfortable to talk about. We think about Native Americans and the Trail of Tears, and we know that conversation can be uncomfortable to have. And so sometimes in conversation that I have, even on campus with teacher educators or other faculty, I say these things are uncomfortable, but it's almost like taking medicine. And so if you could explain and discuss that in a way to where people understand it's gonna be uncomfortable, it's always gonna be untimely, but we're all people, then you're that much closer to having a conversation with them. If you can put it in that perspective. I think when people understand that we're all people and we've come so far and we know where we are and we need to go further, I think that also helps the conversation. When I used to teach high school social studies and I taught the civil rights movement, before I went into that unit, I wouldn't just say, all white people did this and all black people did this and we're gonna move on. I used to preface with my students and say, we've come a long way in America as African Americans, and whites have helped us out a lot too. We need to know where we are and how much further we can go. And with that conversation, people go, oh, it's not just a binary good and bad thing. And so I think getting to a place in conversation with faculty, community members, parents, I think that kind of helps a little bit. Some people may say, oh, well, just make it really comfortable. Well, you're not really doing that. You're just taking them to a different place so you can start to have those uncomfortable conversations, if that makes sense.
That does make sense. Thank you. Ivory, do you have anything to add to that?
I agree with all of that. I also think that there's a great opportunity to utilize asking questions, because someone saying, I think it would make white students feel uncomfortable, is not really getting to the meat of what is actually being stated, I think, there. I think asking some more in-depth questions to really get to the meat of what is the discomfort that individuals are afraid of feeling. And then even maybe pairing it with another question of, as you were speaking about, how would a Japanese student feel in a classroom in discussing Japanese internment? How do black students feel in having to discuss slavery? I think a question I would ask my students all the time when we would talk about the Trail of Tears and talking about indigenous people, do you see any indigenous people in your classroom now? Being able to utilize questions allows people to do the self-work that is really needed in order to move us forward. Guilt does nothing but make people feel bad for a few moments. Having people do the self-interrogating work themselves of answering those difficult questions allows them to move past those feelings of discomfort.
I had a discussion with someone 2 summers ago who said essentially, I don't want someone telling my son that he's bad because he's white. And I was very alarmed that this person thought that that was what was happening in classrooms. I certainly, with all the colleagues that I work with at Hoover High School, I've never worked with anyone who would tell a student something along those lines. I think that's maybe sometimes sort of a mischaracterization of these kinds of discussions. Since we're almost out of time, I have one quick last question that I would like to maybe ask for all of you for a bit of feedback from, which is, what is the danger if we shy away from this work? What happens if we do not have these discussions, if we do not do this kind of work in our schools? What would be the downside? When people say maybe we shouldn't do it, what would be the downside of not doing this work?
Raise your hands up.
I think the downside, I think it really depends on how you view the work. Again, my identity is I'm a black woman, and I have gone my whole entire educational experience not knowing about black history from anyone in the classroom and never expected it. So sometimes it's hard to hear that question because I lived it. And I know that that doesn't mean the end of the work. It doesn't mean the end for us as a community to still put in the effort and work for our children and for other adults to know this information. And so the worst that can happen is that it'll make the work harder. It'll make putting in effort, solidarity together, being creative, being imaginative of how to continue to do this work, it will make it harder, but it doesn't end it. because it never has throughout our history. There have always been people that have pushed back and have actually done the work even when institutions have not allowed them and have not given space for their voices. And so I don't want these conversations to feel like if there's no support with government structures or our societal structures that means the end, because it doesn't.
Thank you. Dr. Samuels, what happens if we don't do this work?
Well, I think everyone in this room can agree that we leave parts of history out. It's almost like painting a house. If you leave one wall unpainted, everyone would see that as, okay, we have an issue here. We didn't paint all the sides of the wall of the house. And so we do the same thing with our dominant narratives in our curriculum. When we don't mention a certain group of people in our books, we leave out that story. And that doesn't just include people of color. That doesn't just include brown people. That doesn't include other areas of demographics. That includes white people in the curriculum. White people have a story and a place and add context to American history. And when we take out that history or not include that history, then we're painting an incomplete picture. And there is something wrong with that. Some socio-political segments of our society will say, it's offensive. Well, some people have been offended all their lives. Some people's stories have been left out all their lives. But it is very, very important to include everybody's story. It's going to be uncomfortable, but people take medicine all the time. It's uncomfortable, but it makes us better. And so this is really good work when we include stories and add context to our curriculum.
Thank you. Dr. Lamar, what happens if we don't do the work you've been doing in our district these past 5 years?
I feel like students will lose their identity. And I feel like it reminds me when I hear folks saying they can go back and trace their roots. And then I look at African Americans who cannot even trace their roots all the way back. And you still have an incomplete history of it all. And for me, that is a very sad moment when you cannot even find the origins of who you are, in a sense, because they cut off the history. And you have individuals without even knowing their names, or even knowing how old they were, when they died. And that history is so important. And if we stop teaching that, it'll be very similar to we have lost who we are, and we will forget who we are, and we become a narrative that is of the mainstream, in a sense. And I feel like that would be a disservice to not only African American students, but all students. Also for teachers as well, because that story it needs to be told, and it needs to be told appropriately and accurately as well. So that's what I feel.
I told my friend 2 summers ago who expressed the concern I mentioned earlier that if we don't do this work, if we don't have these discussions, that's what's going to leave your son in a perilous position as he exits high school and goes off to college and finds himself in a profession without, as Ivory said earlier, the skill set and the ability to understand these issues and to avoid saying something, down the road where out of ignorance he really does run the risk of injuring someone. And so I would argue that's part of why we must do this work. Listen, I cannot thank all. Oh yes, absolutely.
With your analogy of taking medicine, I think if we don't take this medicine, we're going to be sick and get sicker.
That's a logical extension of that metaphor. That's very good. That's exactly right. I think, okay, thank you. That's a really good exclamation point. No, that's very, very good. Why do we take medicine? Because we got something we need to get better from. Yeah. Okay, that's a great point. Well, listen, I would like to express my gratitude to our panelists. Let's give them a round of applause. Also, thank you to all of you for spending your time on a Sunday afternoon to be here and participate in this discussion. As Shilpa mentioned earlier, please don't forget, if you did not have an opportunity to sign in at the table outside the door on your way in, please take a few moments to do that. Don't forget also, you can go to Hoover-AHEAD's website, hoover-ahead.com, and sign up for our mailing list. We'd love to have you as a part of that so that we can keep you in the loop with Hoover-AHEAD events moving forward. And also don't forget that a video of today's panel discussion will be available on YouTube, so if you would like to rewatch it or share it with people that you know who weren't able to be here today, then we hope you'll feel free to do that. So thanks again, everyone, for being here, and we'll see you at our next event down the road.